Hey, it's Jeremy, and I'm back with video number 3 in our series on the Callosum API tool. In previous videos, I walked through creating a basic OpenAPI spec from scratch. We looked at various request methods, including get, post, and delete. We did some parameter validation and went over automatic JSON schema generation. In this video, I'll go over some features that make using APIs in Callosum a little bit nicer, including environment variables, encryption, authentication, and automatic variables. So let's jump it. So if we start off with our get user endpoint, you'd notice that I had to manually type in a user ID each time I wanted to make a request. That can get a little bit tedious, especially as we're hitting a lot of different endpoints that need the same values over and over and over. So one thing that is possible with Callosum is to start making environment variables and using those. So if we switch over to our environment tab, we see we've got a nice little section here for variables. I'm going to create one right now, and I'm going to call it user ID, and I'm just going to put our value right into it. So we'll just say user ID 3 is the one that I'm going to want. So if I head back over to my get user endpoint, I can now replace this value with a double curly bracket in my user ID that I just created. So if I hover over this value, I can see that it's set to 3. So that's pretty nice. We can also go up to our list posts here, and remember we were able to filter by user ID, so I can use the exact same value here. Using that autocomplete again, hit send, and we'll see all the posts by user ID number 3. Pretty nice. So now if I change that value to something else, like say 5, I can come back over here. We'll see I now get user number 5. I can now see all the posts by user number 5, etc. I don't have to retype that same user ID every single time. So the next thing we can look at would be automatic variables. And so this would be one of those situations where, I don't know about you, but often when I'm working with the external API, I might need to look up an identifier in one place and then use it in another place to get more information. We see a really good example of this with the get post endpoint with this user ID. I have no clue who user ID number 5 is in this situation, and I need to go look up what that name is. So Callosum, if you notice, when I click down here inside the response, at the bottom here, it's updating and telling me that this is the path to that variable, to that value in the response. In this case, user ID, in that case, a post ID, title, body. And I get a nice little button here that says create autovar. So if I click on user ID and then hit create autovar, we'll see that it will pop up this box saying that I can create a variable named user ID that uses this JSON pointer to extract the value number 5 from the response. It's a lot of words, but it's a very simple concept, right? It's going to look at the response and take that value for me. So if I hit save, you'll see that it now overlays into the response body. And anytime I hit send, it's going to automatically copy whatever user ID came across this value and put it into my user ID variable. So right now it says user ID of 5. If I go to environment, I'll see my user ID is 5. If I go back to the get post and I change my post ID that I'm looking at to 22, I can now see that user ID should be 3, and it's automatically copied again to that user ID. So again, this will translate to every other endpoint I do. My user ID is 3 here. I can now filter all the posts to user ID number 3, etc. Really handy on that. So what does all this look like in the OpenAPI spec? We can check it out. So if I click over there, I can collapse the schemas because we know that that's a pretty good chunk of the content here. And we'll see things like we've got our environment variables are stored right here. OpenAPI has support for extensions that get ignored by most tools. In this case, we're using our environment variable extension to store any variables in the environment directly into that OpenAPI spec. So we've got our user ID, we've got a description of it, in this case that it's an autovar from the last call to get post, and that last value that just got changed. So that's the environment. If we keep scrolling down here, we will see our AutoVar as well. So in this case, we have our get post endpoint, and we can see that the AutoVar for that user ID from the response body gets mapped directly to that user ID environment variable. And this is, again, stored directly in the OpenAPI. And in this case, this is a link object, which should have welcome to look at the spec and learn more about this specific feature. So that's AutoVars and environment variables. And now we'll jump over to security. So one thing that we can do with security, OpenAPI supports security schemes. We can create a new one here, and let's say that we just want to include an API key in all of our requests, right? So we'll make this a default active. This means that this security scheme gets applied to every single endpoint we create. And we'll say that this is an API key that gets put into a header. So we'll just call our header x-API key, and our key is just going to be super secret. So if I hit save, we can look at the OpenAPI to see what this changed. If I collapse schemas, you'll see that we have the OpenAPI official security schemes component that defines that API key name and exactly how is it configured. It's a header x-API key. So in this case, the security section here is saying that the API key 1 is applied to all endpoints by default. And finally, we have our Callosum specific values where we say that API key 1 is using super secret as the actual key in that component security scheme. So there shouldn't be any other changes to the rest of our spec. Those are enough to configure security settings. So if we head back over to our get post, put in a value here and hit send, and we can see if we go to our headers that x-API key was sent in our request, and it included that value of super secret. So we're not very good at security here because super secret is stored right there in the open inside our OpenAPI spec. That is not good for security. So what we can do here is store that away back into an environment variable. So the first thing to do would be to put the API key into a variable. We'll call it super secret again. This is just the first step. So now that we've got that variable, we can update this key to actually include that API key. We'll hit save. And now we'll see in our OpenAPI spec again, we can see that we've got the super secret value stored in our environment, but our security settings just refer to that variable. So how about let's encrypt this variable now. Callosum supports encryption, basically with clicks to this single column here on the left side of variables. By default, everything's going to be a plain text value. But if we click on this, we'll see that we can set a symmetric encryption key for this. I'm just going to use the word testing, all lowercase in this situation. And now that we have an encryption key set, or a passphrase set, I can click to encrypt this API key. So by default, it just gets masked. If you click on this, you can see the actual value that will get stored. And we'll see that this is actually a AES GCM 256-bit encrypted value with the IV in there. So if I go back to our OpenAPI spec, I can see our security settings only refer to the variable, and our variable is fully encrypted in here. So anytime we see this little icon here, it means that we have a passkey set right here. And that means that any endpoints that need an encrypted variable will be able to transparently